Welcome, everyone. My name is Radha Ruprel. Welcome to this next People First Talk. Really excited about this conversation. But before we get started, just for anyone who's new to this space, just framing what the People First community is and why we are here. So the People First community is a coalition of actors, individuals and organizations, now 500 and growing, that are working across sectors. And we all have the shared belief that if we want to see sustainable development, we have to invest in people. And we have to invest in the leadership of people, particularly those local leaders who are on the ground and most proximate to the challenges we're working to address. And so over the last year, we've been hosting these series of talks with wonderful members from our community to learn from different organizations and leaders about how they're approaching this idea of growing leadership and collective leadership in their context. And so today we have a wonderful guest with us, Safeena Husain. Safeena, maybe give us just a little wave or show your hand. There we go. There's Safeena. Safeena is the founder of Educate Girls, and they have a mission that's very near and dear to my heart, which is all around working in the most remote communities in India to ensure that girls are in school and learning. And the organization has incredible reach, I believe, across 21,000 villages in India. And it is really centering this idea of local leadership. And Safeena will tell us more, but it's all around enabling the leadership of volunteers from these communities. And one other thing I'll share, and then I'll let Safeena take us away from here. But one of the things I'm excited about this conversation is when I spoke to Safeena before this call, what I found that's so powerful about their model is they're both doing the depth work, right? Deep transformative work around mindsets, but also the work of breadth, right? How do we think about impact and results at scale? So we'll get to unpack that all with Safeena in just a moment. Last thing to say, and then we'll get right into it. For any of you who haven't joined one of these spaces before, we want it to be really interactive. So I will be in conversation with Safeena for the next 20 to 30 minutes. But as you have questions, please put them into the chat. We'll bring them right into the conversation, and we'll also create some space at the end and open it up for questions as well. So have your questions ready, put them in the chat, and we'll make this as interactive as possible. All right, so let's get started. Safeena, maybe we'll just start with the basics. If you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the mission of Educate Girls.
Yeah, hi, I'm Safeena. I started Educate Girls 15 years ago. And as our name suggests, work on girls' education. And you're right, Radha, we work in very rural, remote, and tribal areas, which has some of the highest sort of percentage and proportion of out-of-school girls. So as an organization, our heart beats for the out-of-school girls, and bringing those girls, identifying them, bring them back into school, make sure that they're staying and learning is really our core purpose.
Cool. And Safeena, tell us a little bit about then your model. Like, how do you do that? And how do you tap into the leadership of these local community volunteers? How do you recruit them? What does that look like? Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah. So I think before I even get into that, let me just, give you a few words, right? A word like missed call, sorry, enough, last, arrived, fed up. What do you think these words have in common? If there's anybody. These are basically names of girls. I have come across, and we have almost like close to 2,000 girls that in our work we have met who are called Antim Bala, which means the last girl, because everybody hoped that that would be the last girl to be born. We've encountered girls called missed call, because they had put a call to God for a son and they got a missed call. Or names like fed up, or dhapu, or mafi, which means an apology, or achuki, which means arrived. And I think to understand the model, it's to understand patriarchy. It's to understand why girls are not in school, right? And a lot of the reasons they're not in school is because of a mindset issue. In a lot of places, a goat is an asset and a girl is a liability. And that's how it is. And so if that's the thing, then therefore the model had to be built around people. The model had to be built around changing that mindset. And so the entire model is really built about finding that gender champion, somebody who's an educated person, somebody who cares about this purpose at a village level, and then training them, hand holding them, supporting them, and really kind of building their leadership capacity to make sure that we can find every out of school girl in their village and make sure that she's now enrolled in school and staying in school and learning. We call them Team Balika. Balika just means the girl child. So they are the team for the girl child. And today we have about 21,000 such Team Balika, these gender champions at a village level. And they see this as their purpose and their mission. The way we kind of recruit them or the way we find them is very much like, first and foremost, we find geographies with the highest need. So today we are across 4 states, we're in almost like 25,000 villages, but we've done a lot of sort of AI ML work, and we're in those villages that have those 5% of the villages that have 40% of out of school girls in India. So in very deep rural, remote tribal areas. So first the geographic selection, and then actually finding, we host a lot of recruitment events, and we find young people who are passionate about the mission and the cause. So the way I kind of, the team and I talk about it is like, when we're looking for a Team Balika volunteer, we're looking for 3 Ps. We're looking for somebody who is passionate, aligned with our purpose. We're looking for somebody who is proximate, because they have to be from the same village. They can't be an outsider coming in. And then third, we look at is profile. And the profile, we break it down into 3 E's. One is education, because if they're going to be doing learning in school, etc., basic education that is required for that. The second E is experience, if they've had any experience of working anywhere or with a nonprofit. But a lot of the times we don't actually find young people with experience because there are no jobs, in the kind of geographies we find ourselves. So we actually substitute exposure for experience. So if you've gone outside of your village, if you maybe lived in a different state or in a city for a while, you have exposure that I think also builds your capacities. So that's how we kind of think about the profile, or we think about how, what is the sort of prototype of the person we want to bring in. And then we do a lot of training. And then really creating the right training mechanisms and then the right support mechanisms to make sure that they're ready to deliver.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating, Safina. And I think particularly how you're thinking about selecting these local leaders. And it was really heartbreaking to actually hear some of the words around girls. So just this idea that if we're going to change things, we actually have to think about people, and shifting mindsets feels important. So now that you've got these local leaders recruited, tell us a little bit more about how do you grow and foster their leadership? Because this is tough work. What do you do to train them? You mentioned support around them. Just walk us through what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, it's really interesting though, and how we've come upon it. I think first when we started doing this work, I used to think that we just had to get to the right script. If people were saying the right thing when they knocked on the door, then enrollment should happen or people should get convinced. But I think even if you look at our real world, right, there is so much polarization. Do you really think that the right words actually convince anyone at all? Like, think of somebody who has a different political opinion, but it's the same thing, right? And so first we were very, I think, transactional about it, and we kept thinking like there'd be some widget that we could bring to the table that would actually just change the mindset, or the fact that we had to go multiple times, and the more times we went, we would be able to, and that doesn't necessarily happen. So I think we really evolved to the selection process really evolved to get to those 3 Ps, that they had to be proximate and passionate, and filtering for that passion and filtering for that sort of empathy, etc. And in the training, we started to do something very interesting. One is during the orientation, etc., we actually do what the field teams call connect to cause. And it's really about reflecting within to see, why am I really passionate about this cause? And it's very interesting. People will come up with stories about, I saw this discrimination happen with my sister. I saw, or some people will share, very, very, very personal experiences. And that helps them find the connection to the purpose. And for us, that is deeply, deeply, deeply important for everybody who does this work, to actually find that cause to connect, or that connection to the purpose. The second thing is, beyond that, then we kind of do like a case study method almost. I mean, in the field we never call it a case study method, but you look at like a problem, like a story where a girl is not going to school, and because of whatever, and the mother says this and the father said this, and then we have these what we call 7 magical questions. And I'm old now, so don't ask me exactly the sequence of all the 7 magical questions, but they're really about breaking down that problem statement, right? Saying, if Sita, this is happening in her life, how do you see the problem? How do you break it down? What would you do? Or who will come to your help? Who can you ask for help, etc.? So it's a very much kind of going down that pathway. And so this is, I'm just trying to give you a little bit of a flavor of how the trainings actually happen at the community and at the village levels
Yeah.
for our Teen Balika volunteers. And then there's the support part of it. So on every 8 or 10 volunteers, we have a full-time resource person, our field coordinator. And that's a high touch approach. They're actually visiting each volunteer and hand holding them every week to 10 days, right? Because so it's really, really, really sort of all the heavy lifting is really done by the field coordinator. The second is, I think, providing them a peer network, because they come together for the training. A lot of the young people are coming out of their village for the first time, but they're meeting other like-minded people. So that network is something which is, and now with WhatsApp groups and whatnot, it's a really kind of a thriving network. And then finally is the systems lens, the support from the government. So because we have MOUs, etc., the volunteers have an ID card, and they know that the system will support them, the headmaster, the school teachers, the village head, etc., etc. So making sure that they are enveloped in a lot of support as they sort of go about doing this.
That's so interesting. It's really helpful to learn the specifics around how you're thinking about this, Safeena. There's a couple of things I'm going to come back to in a moment around the systems piece. But before we do that, one question in the chat from Dr. Miriam, who heads Teach for Zimbabwe, was just who are the people in the community? Is there an age limit? And I'm also curious, is it just girls? Is it boys? Yeah, who are the local leaders or volunteers you recruit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's an interesting way as well, because we always thought it had to be educated women in the villages. And if you had asked me this when I was starting out, I really imagined like a whole movement of just hundreds and thousands of women coming together to do this for our girls. And yet every time we did these events, because they're like kind of like large recruitment events, right? At a village level. So you could be in a district like Jhabua and you put it in the papers, like, and so people just land up, right? Like 500 people will land up at an event. And we just had like so many men landing up. And we would initially just turn them away saying, sorry, not for you, not for you, not for you. And it really, I'm embarrassed to say how long it took me to realize that what I was seeing was success and not failure. And that how successful it is to actually have young, educated men in in the villages coming and actually saying, I want every girl in my village to go to school. And I wanted to slap myself silly saying, oh my God, like, it didn't hit me. I was so in my own bias, my own prejudice saying the only people who will care about this are other women. And then we just heard like these incredible stories of men and why they wanted to make this change happen as well. So I think, it is, and they're young and they're educated. So they have minimum education level is about 12th grade, and some of them are finished their 12th grade and are pursuing like the undergraduate degree through open school or distance education because there are no access to colleges even for them. Majority of them are between the ages of 19 to 25. We do get some outliers, and in some very remote villages we will relax a lot of that criteria, but majority would be that sort of an age group.
Yeah, no, that's
And
incredible.
now we have more than 50% are young men, which is also
Wow.
really fabulous. Really, really,
That,
really fabulous.
that's really incredible, Safeena. And also just hearing your own personal journey with that. We talk so much about collective leadership and having actors across the system, but I just think it's so important that as we're dealing with things like gender, we do have to bring together people from all sides of the spectrum. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's so incredible that 50% of the people now involved in this are men. I think that would make such a difference. Let me ask you one more question, and then I might
Mhm.
switch gears a little bit to the scale and system impact. But before that, as we're talking about mindsets, as you did this work to grow the capacity of these local leaders, and is there anything else you learned, or is there anything else you had to unlearn in working with this group of volunteers from the community?
Mm, that's a really good question. I mean, I think I learned a lot in terms of how purpose really moves people and how everybody is looking for purpose sort of in their lives, in some ways. And all we have to do is kind of just provide the platform for it, and people will come and people will join you, and to have faith. And it's very interesting. And I see this with, new people who join Educate Girls, like when we get into a new state or something. The new employees have no faith, even though they know that we have like thousands and thousands of people who have done it before. They'd be like, but madam, I don't think in our area this will work. I'm like, just relax, have faith. And I think just having that faith and helping others to have that faith is really like a large chunk of our work is really to kind of see that. That's one thing. And I think, oh my God, I try and unlearn things every day. So there are too many, too many to list. I find like I make the same mistakes. I do, all kinds of rubbish. But yeah, I've really found that purpose, I think, is really important to people. And I think the biggest lesson that I have learned is it's never about the tool or the framework or whatever. It is about the people.
Mm.
And if you can, and like even with the volunteers, we asked them, said, what is your slogan? If you had to write up a slogan. And they said, my village, my problem, I'm the solution. And it's just that it's like if you throw back the ownership, I mean, people take ownership and people actually run with it, if they are sort of in alignment with your mission and your purpose.
Yeah, these are such consistent themes with what we've been hearing throughout these talks. But I really love this intentionality around purpose, this idea that we must each own it, but also that you've created collective spaces where people can investigate their purpose alongside others and hear stories of others, which I can imagine also inspires and activates them. There's a
Yeah.
great question in the chat, and maybe Ali, if you don't mind, I might ask you to come off mute and just introduce yourself and share your question, just because it's a great one.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Safeena. I'm so inspired listening to you speak. I work for a multi-academy trust in the UK, and my specific area of focus is thinking about how we develop leaders in education and how we encourage people to take that on and to take the mantle in such a challenging climate where it's really, really difficult. I was just wondering, like, how much you think like domain specific knowledge about like say education or about the specific village or about the people really matters in comparison to like more general leadership skills. So when you're thinking about what makes your really excellent volunteers, like what would you say the balance is there? And I'm curious if you do any like really like specific leadership training, if you talk about we're developing our resilience or we're developing our inspiration or whatever. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. That's a really good question, Ali. And we're actually yeah, so let me break that. Like first, let me just give you a sense of how Educate Girls, the team is kind of, what does it look like, right? So we have the Team Balika volunteers at the village level. And then our field coordinators come from the same clusters, not necessarily the same village. So they are kind of still proximate, but they don't have to be, from the same village, etc. And then we have like somebody on every 10 or 12 field coordinators, the block officer, and then like a district officer and a district team, etc. Since we started, in our organization, we have almost 3,000 full-time employees, and we are, like I said, 21,000 community volunteers, of which I would say around 50 are in urban areas and like Mumbai, and everybody else is from the same villages and from the same area. Our head of operations is somebody who started with me in the first district where we started working. His family is still farming in that district, in their village. He does not speak English, nor is he great with like PowerPoints and all the trappings of what we would think that, a multi-million-dollar nonprofit leadership may look like. It's actually very field-driven leadership. Our person who is sort of one of our senior leaders who is running one of the projects. He actually was married in the third grade as well. So he comes to this because he knows what child marriage did for him. It took away his agency, it took away his choice. Our head of monitoring and evaluation for the state of Rajasthan, one of our oldest states, is actually somebody who joined us as a volunteer. So the reasons I give, our head of communications is Meena Ji in Rajasthan. And she is one of the original team members. And I remember in the early days when we used to work in a village meeting, she had to wear a veil till here to be able to speak in front of elders. So actually, I hope I'm trying to paint a picture for you of what this team really looks like. They are very, very, very much representative of the field person who joined us, our volunteers who are now heading districts, our volunteers who are now actually heading different functions. So we grow our own timber. The way we grow our own timber is really there are a lot of different things. One is, I think, making sure that everybody does an enormous amount of field work. So even at a senior leadership level, when I hire a head of fundraising, or I could be hiring somebody for strategy, but they have to sit in the field with me at ground zero in the villages for an extended amount of time and absorb things. Unless they really understand the field, unless they defer to people in the field, they cannot be part of the leadership. So one is that is really kind of core. Second is, I think, just building visibility. So we have a lot, so it's kind of like you can think about it as job rotation or whatever, but everybody needs to sort of breaking down these departmental silos. So people are rotating through a lot of different things and really investing in their kind of capacity building. So I'll tell you, Vikram Solanki, who now runs our 4 states operations, he started with me as a data entry M&D assistant, then grew to a training officer, then grew to running an entire district operations. And then we, against the advice of all of our donors, funders, all of our board members who wanted us to get some corporate person and some Harvard person to run the world's first development impact bond when we launched it. Nobody had ever done it in the world. And they were like, oh, get somebody ex-McKinsey or get somebody blah, blah, blah. We actually went back to Vikram Solanki and we said, we're going to go back to our field purpose. And he actually led our development impact bond and took it to like great results and scale. So I think just believing in our people, believing that they have the capacity, the talent is all there, and then just providing them the support and the visibility and the exposure to actually grow. I don't even know if I answered your question, but I hope I did.
Oh no, that was amazing, and it's an issue that we're really trying to grapple with in our own organisation. Very different contexts, but similar challenges. So no, it's really incredible to hear. Thank you.
Yeah, and Safeena, I think it gets to one of the core kind of ideas that have come up through so many of these talks, that really believing in the agency of those who again are just closest to the challenges, and then providing supports around them, but actually knowing that they may have the most wisdom to tackle these challenges. And what I'm really struck by is your commitment to doing that when you have pressures from the outside around, well, this type of person is a leader, actually disrupting that paradigm by saying, well, no, we actually think these folks who come from the communities are the ones who actually can lead the work. So yeah, so appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. No, I think for us, sorry, this is really, really, really important, because I think people's mental models around what talent looks like is so hooked into English. It's so hooked into, especially in India, right? I mean, that's what good talent looks like. And for us, we actually have a very, very, very different mental model of that, of who qualifies as great talent in the organization.
Yeah, and there's a great question from Parveen in the chat that actually relates to this. So Parveen is saying, when organizations grow big, right, as large as your organization, the purpose is to reach the last person in the organization. But sometimes as we grow in terms of our hierarchy and layers, the challenges from the ground, you're saying, are suppressed by middle management to reach top management. So how do you tackle this and keep everyone connect, all your staff members connected to purpose, especially as you scale. And you spoke a little bit about at the outset having them being grounded in community work, but is there anything else that you think about, and have you run up against these challenges as you've scaled as an organization? And I see a smile, so
I'm smiling because this year, because we completed 15 years, and I'd made a resolution saying I would actually, even though like we're almost 25,000 people now who are part of this family, I had actually made a commitment to myself that I would, during our 15-year annual day celebrations, actually attend each and every event so that I would have at least this thing to say that, I saw the entire team. I had some level of direct interaction with them. And it took me 3 months, rather. But we did it, and the entire senior leadership did it, and everybody made time to make sure, because you have to dedicate that kind of time for us to feel like one family. And I think, again, the storytelling, the purpose, and just keeping the purpose at the center of everything is what really kind of helps us. So we have a lot of like town halls, or we have a lot of different events where people come together to actually celebrate the purpose, but then also to sort of connect and make sure that you're sort of breaking down those barriers. So we have our volunteers have a core sort of advisory group kind of a thing, like their own leadership team, where they host webinars for other volunteers. They bring them to Mumbai. Like, so the volunteers themselves create a lot of energy about sort of making sure that, we are all staying connected, and the scale is not necessarily killing us with the hierarchy.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Just staying connected, and also who are the people who keep us accountable. So that's interesting to hear. Well, let's switch gears. I'm going to ask you one question, and then I'll bring in another question from the chat. But we've talked a lot about this deeper work, these mindset shifts. I know when I spoke to you before, you also said that in addition to that, there's also the results focus, a real focus on results at scale. So can you actually tell us, how do you do that? How do we decide you're seeing results in a community? How do you decide to stay with a community versus go to another one? Just give us a little bit more of a flavor for that, and then I'll bring in one more question from the chat.
Yeah. So I think for us, that results orientation is really core to our purpose. So it isn't just saying, oh, our heart beats for the out of school girl. It actually means that our work is not done till we know exactly who that girl is, until that girl is in school and learning and sort of progressing. What that translates into is a few things. One is that we actually stay in a geography. So we've only been doing one thing for 15 years, and that is this model. So it keeps evolving a little bit, but it's like a single sort of, I would say it's a single strategy. It's not like other NGOs where they're project based and they do this and they do that, whatever. It's like a kind of a laser focus. There is no room for mission drift and mission creep. Absolutely not. And the other sort of thing that this does is you have to stay in a village or in a geography till the problem of out of school girls is actually solved and stays solved. So I'll give you an example. Our first district in Pali, when we actually started work in Pali, the gender gap was almost 19%. So there was a 19% enrollment gap between boys and girls. It was one of the highest in the state. By the time we left Pali, the gender gap had reduced to around 3% or under 3%. And that's where it stays till date, right? So we spent almost a decade in Pali, in those villages, and having a presence in those villages. It did not leave that till actually we knew that the outcomes had been delivered, the results had been delivered. The other side of this is, I'm just going to give you an example of what I really mean by this, is like, and we used to do a lot of this experimentation in the DIB as well. Like, you can actually go into a village and show a movie about girls' education, and you can do a pre and post survey. And then people are like, I don't know if I send my daughter to school. And then they see the movie, and then you do a survey or a discussion. And then people are like, oh, yes, it's very important. And a lot of the times people think that's enough, and say everybody's touched, reached, and transformed or whatever. For us, till the actual behavior change happens, until every girl in that village is going to school, our work is not done. And so just the activity is not important. The eye is always on the result, which means that some geographies, we are there for like 8 years, and some geography where in those villages, we're there for 10 years. We also say 6 to 8 years because we want to do almost 10 cohorts, which constitutes a generation. Because you're like, if you can, then you know that the mindset change is not going to reverse, because the whole equilibrium in that village has shifted from people saying, oh, we don't send our daughters to school, to being like, listen, rather, you're the only one who's not sending your daughter to school. So to really bring about that equilibrium shift. And it's interesting because we're making our next sort of 10-year vision. And so we looked back at our oldest districts in Rajasthan. And what we've realized is that all of our districts that we were in were, are outperforming the state of Rajasthan in gender metrics, not just in terms of school participation and, school pass out rates, etc., but also in terms of health metrics. Much faster reduction in child marriage, so all of those. And that's the multiplier effect that you harvest when you have that mix of purpose, but the results orientation. But which is very hard, by the way, because it's very hard to find money to actually work like that.
Yeah, no.
But that is something that our board will not let us ever deviate from, saying either you work that way or you don't work at all.
And Safeena, this is there's so many insights in here, just naming a couple, right? One, the idea of really being clear on mission and avoiding scope creep, because otherwise you can't scale if you're trying to do 10 different models. So that's really powerful. But the second idea of staying the long game and recognizing that the challenges we face are systemic. So it's around girls' education, early marriage. If we're not tackling these issues, and how do you go about that? The volunteers, do they just focus on the education intervention? Do they talk to parents about child marriage, right? Just in terms of that scope, recognizing it's quite holistic and it's not one issue that's driving girls out of school. Like how does that work in practice, or what guidance do you give to volunteers? And then Wendy, I'm going to bring you off mute to share your question after this.
Yeah, I think for us, sorry, I forgot what your question was. You were like, what is the...
Yeah, so I think the question is just in terms of what the volunteers do with the girls. Do they focus just on getting them into school, or do they also talk to parents about child marriage and all of these related issues that contribute to the challenge?
These were issues we really discussed a lot as a team, like when we were starting out, because we're like, oh, there's so much, and we should talk about this. And there is a tendency to try and get really broad, because you're like, oh my God, you have the person in the village, you should do all of these things, and they all are really important and they have to be done. But we realized that if you wanted a long-term relationship and if you wanted doors to open, to have access to the girls, we had to limit the conversation to education, at least to start off with, till we had trust in the system, right? So when you are knocking on somebody's door, you don't start with the child marriage piece, because you will have the door shut in your face, and you will actually have, every door will be shut in your face, and you'll be out of there, they'll push you out in like a few weeks. So the entire conversation is very much, the door opening conversation is about education, and it stays around education. However, our volunteers see that, a girl hasn't come to school for a week or whatever, or there's chatter within the friends saying something special is about to happen. If they understand that this is going to happen, they immediately actually make a visit to the family. They may do a lot of different things. They may, highlight it to the school teachers, or they may highlight it to the relevant authorities around that. We've also had volunteers who just call up the child line number and kind of report if they see something like this happening. So they will look at that. However, in terms of our direct, like door opening conversations, it is around education.
Great, that's helpful to hear. Wendy, I might just bring you on to share your question as it relates to this idea of results and how do we know where we're having the most impact?
I mean, I'm just curious, Safeena, when you've looked across these communities where you've worked, if some are just real outliers in terms of the results that they've gotten, and kind of what is at work in those outliers that's kind of informed the rest of your system. Like, does that question make sense in your context?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, there's a lot that so one is just the study of this, right, over the 15 years. They're saying, why is it that we get why do we get different distribution of out-of-school girls? at village level, right? First of all, just that question was really baffling for us, because we would get into a district with, let's say, 1,000 villages, and we would find 80% of all out of school girls in like 30% of the villages. And we're like, what is it about these villages that makes it, explode in terms of out of school girls? And just the clusters and the villages in the same sort of district are not showing that pattern. And so overall, what we figured out is it's the three P's mainly, and now there's a fourth P, but three P's of poverty, patriarchy, and policy. And wherever these three P's intersect, you get explosions of out of school girls. So patriarchy is social marginalization. And that's basically the proxies for that would be like caste, etc. Right? Poverty, class. If you have money, if you go to a private school, you go to a government school, etc., etc. And policy, like how, how strongly does policy reach you? It could be like distance from the main village. It could be from the main road, like how far you are from the main road will just weaken the kind of policy, right? And then these three elements interact with each other. So you have class, caste, and then you have gender. So if you are in these villages where poverty, patriarchy, and policy are interacting, the outliers where you will see results just do not shift are ones that are really at the bottom of all of these three. They don't have identification documentation. They are migrant labor. They have to keep moving to be able to survive. These are the outlying areas. I'm sort of flipping your piece here, Wendy, is where it is very hard to drive results. But where the situation is a little bit better in terms of the three Ps, we will actually see that we can make movement. And we can make movement fairly easily. But it's those are the factors that sort of determine where things will move and where things may not move so easily.
And can I ask one more follow-up, Radha? So, and I may have just missed this earlier, but how do you think about so you have numbers of volunteers in each community. Like, how do you think about the scale of your presence within a community? And I'm just curious if you've learned something about like what constitutes critical mass, like when do you have enough people going at the issue, or if that's part of the differentiator too.
Yeah, so because we work in very rural and remote villages, our villages tend to be small because they are remote. They're kind of scattered and remote, etc. So generally one volunteer per village is actually enough because they sort of know everybody. We're looking at like a 500 household or, thereabout kind of an area. So we have one volunteer per village, which is generally enough, especially if you're creating the support mechanism, because we have MOUs with the government. So your village head, your school, headmaster, teachers, all of them are also oriented to actually cooperate with you as part of your MOU. So that in itself is a good critical mass. If we really get into larger villages, which we don't because we actually zero work in urban and peri-urban areas, and we focus only on deep rural, then we may have maybe 2 volunteers, but that's kind of generally enough.
Thanks. Thank you, Safeena. Let me you just mentioned this notion of some of the more challenging villages is where you are seeing poverty, class, caste, and there's a related question in the chat from Avantika. Maybe you can come off mute and share your question.
Thanks, Radha. Hi, Safeena.
Hi.
My question was, what kind of additional barriers did you face when working with socially marginalized communities like scheduled tribes and scheduled castes, knowing that there is, often a caste dynamic in a lot of these villages? Love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, what barriers did you face, and also maybe anything you've learned about how to overcome those as well?
Yeah, so I think for me, definitely, I never, like a lot of people who grew up in urban areas, I never had that deep an understanding of caste as, I was kind of like, that I saw, like when I actually started working in villages. It is a huge barrier, and it is a massive barrier. So even if you look at village after village, we see this, like where the assets are located, where your school is located, where your health facilities are located, are very much determined by caste, right? Where your out of school girls are going to be is going to be on the, with the socially, they're only mainly with the SC, ST, and OBC communities, right? That is all that we see is that is, I would say, 99% of the out of school girl population that we're working with are coming from those communities. They tend to be on the periphery of the villages, or they tend to be in hamlets outside of those villages, right? So you actually see that. So therefore, their access even within the village can sometimes become difficult, especially if they have to walk. I mean, I've seen girls who have to walk like half a mountain, just to be able to reach the school, because all the infrastructure and assets are actually not necessarily built around those communities. So those are big challenges. I think in the past we've also seen, like, people. So in community mobilization, who are the influencers you need to bring in? So a lot of the times in a mohalla meeting, which is like a neighborhood meeting, you may want to get the caste leader, or you may want to get, their sort of Samaj leader, which is kind of like a representative of the religious leader. So it really does determine who you need to pull in, who people will listen to, and stuff. So it does play a huge role, and it is a massive barrier, but you have to think through it. And that's where approximate leadership and your community volunteers really come in to play, because that's the local knowledge that they have. They know who is it that this person will actually listen to, right? They know that who is the right influencer for them. So therefore, that community ownership layer is really key to working where we work.
Safeena, just to build on that, there's another question in the chat that's just around, it must be so challenging for these volunteers at times. These are not easy conditions, and they're dealing with so many barriers. So how do you support them? Just what have you learned about supporting them through the challenges, and what that requires in reality?
Yeah. Like I said, I think even with the volunteers, I mean, the heavy lift, like I said, in terms of the work, is really being done by our field coordinator. The volunteers are there to provide local sort of relationships. They're there to provide, like exactly what I said. They know who lives where, what needs to happen, who needs to talk. That's the heavy lift that they're doing, is they're bringing that village knowledge, the knowledge of the networks and the people to the field coordinator. Whether it is going door to door, whether it's mobilizing, whether it's setting up village meetings, a lot of the heavy lift is done by the field coordinator, who is a very highly trained person in that sense. Yeah. What else for you?
And Safeena, you mentioned before that they have peer networks. How does
yeah,
that
they have
and how does that work? Because again, like connecting to purpose, dealing with challenges, does that support it all, or to what extent?
No, I think the peer networks are there, but also, like, I think for us, I know it sounds heavy, but actually there's an enormous amount of joy in our work. I mean, this year for our Foundation Day event, we had one of the top Bollywood composers compose like an anthem, like a song, which is like this. And then we had like hook steps and dance steps to go with it. And everybody like dances to this, and it's played like, and like during December, January, everybody's ringtone was this song. Like, there's an enormous amount of joy. There's an enormous amount of energy. And it comes from all of us being together for this purpose, right? Yeah. So it isn't just like a tearjerker journey. I have to just be, it is hard. The work is hard. However, they're also working for their own village. They're working for their own children. And there is respect in that. And there is credibility in that. And, when people walk past, they're like, oh, teacher, teacher, teacher. There's a lot of joy that this kind of brings in, a lot of respect that it brings in for everybody. And the challenges are there. And I think, having done this for 15 years, we also know how to mitigate, how to sort of get past these challenges. And we also have the patience. We know that it will take time. So you have to keep doing the meeting again, or you have to keep going again, or whatever. So, but I think what we really do bring is the peer networks and enormous amount of just joy and fun to this for the volunteers, because you can't have a whole movement of young people and not have fun and joy as part of it.
Yes, I think that's so great to mention. And I think you also touched on one of the other questions in the chat, is what keeps people motivated, but also the intrinsic motivation that you get from serving your community. You mentioned kind of the respect that you get when you're in these positions.
Yeah, and for a lot of the women, I think, and I never understood this when they would come to training, and I asked them, I was like, why do you come? You have to do household work, and then you have to get up at 4 a.m. and then somebody has to bring you and all this. And they said, because when we come here, we feel equal. And I was like, what does that mean? You feel equal? And it was just, I couldn't understand what was the symbol of this respect and equality that they were feeling. And they said, at home, we're the last ones to eat. But at the training, girls and boys eat together. And it could be something just really as simple as that, that makes them feel that they're part of a movement and they're part and that they're respected and.
Yeah, we've spoken a lot around, again, in these talks around oftentimes collective leadership is built in small moments, changes in behaviors and practices and norms, and these small things around how women and men are treated equally in spaces. I mean, those small things are actually in some ways the big things. One other follow-up question to that is, so I think it's balancing both the joy, but also providing supports. How do you support them around some of the difficult issues that come up? So one of the questions was around, I know gender-based violence is such a huge issue in many of these communities. Is there any additional support given, or how do these deeper issues get elevated if need be?
Yeah. So I think we do provide a lot of support. I mean, we have helplines, for our volunteers, etc., in all of our districts where they can kind of call in. Like I said, there's a whole sort of volunteer management committee, which is built of, volunteers, so that these are team Balikas who actually run it. And like I said, for support and for their own development, this is the committee that actually does an enormous number of activities. We also invest very heavily in their own growth. A lot of our Team Balika volunteers want to become teachers. So we actually help them, figure out whether it's their coaching for the teacher entrance exam or whatever it is. Soft skills, how do you build your own resume? How do you search for a job? We also link them to livelihood programs or career building programs, so or their own skill building. So we actually go and source everything in the universe where our volunteers can actually go and kind of move forward in their careers. We have lots of volunteers who've now become, either they join us or they've got jobs and they've sort of been able to. So the support is for their own journey. The support is in the works, either through helpline or through their field coordinator, etc. We also train them on being able to provide community further support. So like you were mentioning about gender violence, a lot of the times, even beyond the gender violence, like they don't have documentation. How do I help families get access to social protection schemes? How do I help them get their basic documentation in place? So there's a lot of additionality that the volunteers will actually bring to the families. During COVID, because you mentioned specifically about that, about the gender violence, during COVID, our volunteers were actually telling us about how their whisper networks that women were running in the villages, right? Like where they knew, women would come out at 5 p.m. every day to like dry clothes or do something so that the women in the neighborhood could see them. And if they didn't, like somebody would either call you or come knock on your door saying, "Are you okay?" Or "Can I just have a cup of sugar?" or something like that. Because where they felt there were vulnerabilities, people were actually just coming together to sort of support each other.
Yeah, that's so helpful just to hear the range of supports that are around them and the different levels. Let me switch gears, Safina, to one more thing that we touched on at the beginning of the conversation. And everyone, we've probably got space for one or two more questions. So if you've got a burning question, please do put it in the chat. But Safina, early in the conversation, we talked about government. And in these spaces, we've been talking a lot about collective leadership. You need local community leaders, but you also need government to scale. So can you tell us a little bit about your biggest learnings in working with government? And also, how do you ensure the voices of these community leaders are present and elevated in these higher level spaces?
Yeah. I think the way I see our organization is basically at the bottom is the community ownership and at the top is the government. And we're simply a kind of a linkage or a catalyst in between the two. So that's how in some ways I kind of see it. All of our work is in partnership with the government. So we have MOUs for every single village and school where we work, which also provides us with all the government support that we need to actually be able to sort of do this, at scale. So there is no parallel delivery. Basically, if we are, successful, the government will look successful. Like it's all aligned in terms of our goals are actually also aligned with the government's goals. So in that way, there's a seamlessness to it. few things that we do to further make sure that that supply side to the demand side connection is smooth is one, we have fairly large kind of PMU presence in, let's say, in Uttar Pradesh and in some of the state partnerships, so that we're supporting the state with the critical kind of pieces that they need at the state level. The rest of our org structure actually mirrors the government's org structure, so that each person, so our block level officer is actually working with the block level officer of the government. Our district manager is working with the district collector, so that at every level, there is a connection, there is mobilization, and there's a support, so that the work with the government is actually really, really, really closely aligned to sort of take this forward. The second is, I think we invite a lot of the government people, let's do it, to our annual day, or take our volunteers to meet with the government functionaries and things like that. So there is a lot of that that continues to sort of happen. Finally, I think our tools are all embedded, and as much as possible now we're embedding within the government. So for example, one of the states this year, the entire survey that they did for out of school children was using our app that we built, which is very robust in terms of testing for inclusion errors, exclusion errors. Every village gets geotagged, like the data comes in real time, is really clean, it helps you build heat maps. So there's a lot of this other stuff that we do, which is really just sort of taking everything we're building and then embedding it to make sure that that systems change lines really happens.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. This idea that's actually such a deep partnership that you're embedding at all levels in terms of how you're setting up your structures, how you're collecting data, et cetera. Let me ask one more question in the chat that builds on this. One person asked, curious if there's data on what the volunteers go on to do after their work with you all. Do they, and you mentioned this a little bit, some of them end up being staff members, do others end up being long-term community activists? Like once they're in the movement, are you tracking what's happening to them? Are they connected in any way? Tell us a little bit more about this group over the long term.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we were tracking them a lot more sort of deeply. We haven't, and maybe we should start doing that very much. But we see that hundreds of them are actually recruited by us because our scale is so aggressive. Well, last year we hired about 800 people. This year we may be hiring another 800 people or 900 people or so. So our own scale, it actually fuels an enormous amount of growth and pulls a lot of the volunteers in. Plus, like with our work in terms of their own skill building, a lot of them are actually going into, we have partnership with like Pratham and other people where they're going into the skilling centers, they're going into job opportunities. So there's a fairly large number that we're also placing in other areas. But it's very interesting. Like I went back to Pali this year, which was our first district where we started, and I found that around 300 of our oldest team Balikas were still on a WhatsApp group and were exactly what Wendy's typed in here, saying the long-term community activists. Like, so whatever else they might be doing, they're still connected. I mean, I went to one village and my phone blew up because I was like, oh, you're back in Pali. Do we get to see you? And that connection and that long-term activism, I think once it's there, it just continues.
That's incredible, Safeena. We're just about out of time, and the sign of a good conversation is there's always many more questions in the chat that we could address. There's a few more, and Safeena, maybe I'll share those with you offline if there's any information you can share with us. But just as we wrap up, I just wanted to give you one final word. Is there anything else you didn't get to share that you want to share with us, or just anything? Yeah, and any last words that you want us to remember from your work? Sorry, no, that's a big question to throw at you. And you can also say no, you've been able to cover it all.
I just have to say, I think I went through a leadership transition last year. I don't know why I'm ending with that, but like it has been so liberating. And for me, it was like the sort of the thing I had really aspired for is saying, start an organization, build it up, and then to have somebody else, become the CEO. And that's been really powerful for me. And the CEO is Maharshi Vaishnav, who's given, over a decade to this mission and to this purpose. And to, again, like going back to what Ali was, her question there, saying, somebody who's grown through the system, 11 years out of our 15 years of existence is now the CEO. And somebody who started with us in Bali is like the head of operations, is like the thing that I hold the dearest. And that is exactly what you guys are trying to do with the whole people first approach. And honestly, like, it is truly the best thing. So I just want to congratulate you, because I have learned so much from your work. And I really wanted to sort of mention that I continue to learn so much. And I think, Wendy, you're so deeply inspiring in what you have created. And I think what you do at a school level, and we've just tried to, in some shape or form, replicate it, but at a village level. So we are very inspired by your work and by your model, and your entire approach.
Well, thank you so much, Safeena. I mean, I'm just struck by your investment in local leadership. Really, it's kind of the philosophy of this entire network of organizations across the people first community, and it's been so incredible learning from you. I see a number of hearts on the screen, and so just for those of us who joined, we're going to be sharing some insights and a video from this conversation in case you want to watch again or share with your colleagues. And what is coming up next? We actually have another talk later this month, at the end of the month, with Cheryl Dorsey, who leads Echoing Green. As many of you know, that's an organization that supports emerging social entrepreneurs around the world and invests in their leadership. And they're doing some incredible work to build a very diverse pipeline of leaders. So we'll get to hear more from Cheryl on her work and what she's learned there. But one more time, a big thank you, Safeena, to joining us and for everything you shared. And thanks everyone for being a part of today and just being very engaged.
Thank you. Thank you so much.